Camera flashes detonated against the marble walls of Meridian Tower, bleaching the lobby in bursts of white as investors clustered beneath crystal chandeliers and waited for spectacle. Outside, Manhattan traffic roared past sheets of glass that reflected a city built on ambition. Inside, champagne hovered in raised hands, expensive laughter folding neatly into the hum of wealth. Rachel Whitmore stood at the center in a silver gown that caught every light in the room, chin lifted, smile sharpened by years of winning. Tonight was about power. Who held it, who deserved it, who could be reminded of their place. Then the side doors opened. Connor Shaw stepped in from the service corridor, tall, composed, the cut of his dark suit deliberate against the faint roughness of hands that had known steel cables and grease. His eyes moved once across the room, not searching, not intimidated, measuring. Conversations thinned into whispers as recognition flickered. The elevator mechanic. A joke. Rachel approached with effortless grace, microphone in hand, voice silk over steel. "Connor," she said, projecting warmth for the cameras, "I hope you're not overwhelmed. Rooms like this can be unfamiliar." A few guests smiled too quickly. Connor met her gaze without lowering his own. "I'm comfortable wherever the truth needs to rise," he replied evenly. "Elevators taught me that." The air tightened. Somewhere beneath the polished floors and billion-dollar promises, something older than the IPO shifted. A memory, a cost, a name that had never fully disappeared. Rachel had invited him to prove she controlled every level of her empire. She did not yet realize that Connor Shaw had walked in carrying something heavier than humiliation. And before the night was over, the highest floor in the building would feel dangerously close to a fall. If stories about power, dignity, and consequences speak to you, like this video and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales. The room had already decided who Connor Shaw was before he ever touched the microphone. Meridian Tower's grand ballroom glowed in layers of gold and crystal, a monument to money polished until it reflected nothing imperfect. Waiters moved like clockwork between clusters of investors, refilling glasses that never truly emptied. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves, each conversation orbiting numbers, influence, expansion. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume and quiet competition. At the center of it all stood Rachel Whitmore, silver gown sculpted to precision, chin lifted, shoulders squared as if the building itself rose from her spine. She thrived in rooms like this. She understood how to command them, how to bend attention without appearing to try. Tonight was supposed to be another victory lap before the markets opened. Another confirmation that she had climbed higher than anyone who once doubted her. Then she saw him again. Connor stood near the edge of the crowd, not hiding, not posturing, simply observing. His charcoal suit cut a clean line against his frame, understated but exact. His hands rested loosely at his sides, though faint marks along his knuckles hinted at years spent gripping steel cables instead of champagne flutes. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling either. He looked present. And that unsettled her. Rachel had invited him for contrast, for spectacle, for that subtle, delicious imbalance where wealth brushes against labor and reminds it who owns the room. She had expected gratitude or awkwardness. Instead, Connor seemed grounded in something she couldn't measure. A board member leaned toward her. "That's him," he murmured, barely disguising amusement. "The elevator guy." Rachel's lips curved. "Yes," she said smoothly. "We like to show we value every level of the company. Every level." She lifted her glass and tapped it lightly against the microphone stand. The room responded instantly. Conversations dimmed. Attention sharpened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice warm as honey poured over steel. "Before we toast to tomorrow's launch, I want to recognize someone who represents the backbone of Meridian." A ripple of polite approval moved through the audience. Rachel extended her hand toward Connor. "Connor Shaw, our dedicated elevator technician. Connor, would you join me up here?" The words were framed as generosity. The invitation staged as inclusion. But beneath it lay something sharper. An expectation that he would shrink beneath the spotlight, that he would stumble through gratitude while 300 executives watched. Connor felt the shift the moment his name echoed through the hall. Every gaze landed on him at once. Curious, skeptical, entertained. He inhaled slowly. For years he had lived in rooms no one noticed. Service corridors. Basements that hummed with machinery. Places where the only sound was the mechanical certainty of systems doing their jobs. He had grown comfortable in invisibility. But invisibility had never erased memory. He walked toward the stage without haste, each step deliberate. The sound of his shoes against marble seemed louder than it should have been. Cameras lifted. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. Rachel handed him the microphone, leaning close enough for only him to hear. "Don't be nervous," she whispered. "Just keep it simple." Her breath smelled faintly of champagne and control. Connor looked at her. Not with resentment, not yet, but with something steadier. Then he turned to the crowd. For a moment he said nothing. Silence has weight when you let it. 300 people shifted in their seats. "I fix elevators," Connor began, voice even and unforced. "Most of the time nobody thinks about that. They just press a button and expect to rise." Few quiet chuckles. "That's the point," he continued. "When things are built right, you don't notice the work. You only notice when something breaks." The laughter faded. Rachel felt a thin thread of discomfort tighten beneath her ribs. This wasn't stumbling. It wasn't gratitude. It was measured. Connor's gaze moved slowly across the room. He saw the cufflinks worth more than his monthly rent. The tailored suits stitched for power. The effortless assumption that rooms like this were permanent. "An elevator," he said calmly, "is a simple promise. You step inside. You trust the cables. You trust the brakes. You trust the people who signed off on its safety." A faint crease appeared between Rachel's brows. Connor's tone did not rise, but something in it deepened. "And when that trust is broken, it doesn't just fall," he added softly. "It takes someone with it." The ballroom grew very still. A woman near the front lowered her glass slowly. Someone near the back stopped mid-whisper. Rachel stepped slightly closer, smile tightening. "Connor," she interjected lightly, "perhaps tell them what you enjoy most about working at Meridian." Her voice carried brightness, but there was pressure beneath it. Connor didn't look at her. "What I enjoy most," he said evenly, "is making sure what happened once doesn't happen again." The words hung there. No accusation yet. No names. Just implication. Rachel's heartbeat ticked louder in her ears than the chandelier lights humming above them. She had expected a punchline. Instead, she felt something else forming. Something slower, heavier. Connor's fingers adjusted slightly around the microphone. His posture remained steady, but inside, memory pressed forward with sharp clarity. Hospital lights reflecting off metal rails. His mother's hand trembling in his, a closed casket that felt too small for a life that had been so certain. He swallowed once, but his voice did not waver. "Sometimes," he continued, "the difference between success and tragedy is whether someone listens when they're warned." The room no longer felt indulgent. Felt aware. Rachel sensed it too, the subtle shift of allegiance that occurs when curiosity turns into concern. Investors were no longer amused. They were attentive. And Rachel Whitmore, who had built her empire on controlling perception, felt perception beginning to move beyond her grasp. Connor finally turned his head slightly toward her. Not confrontational, just present. "You invited me here tonight," he said calmly. "So I figured I'd speak honestly." The air seemed to thin. Rachel's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Honesty," she repeated, forcing a soft laugh. "We value that at Meridian." Connor held her gaze for half a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed. "I know," he replied. And in that simple exchange, something irreversible began. The ballroom no longer felt like Rachel's stage. It felt like a fault line waiting to split. The word honesty did not land the way Rachel intended. Did not sound like branding. Sounded like a dare. Connor felt the weight of 300 eyes pressing against him, measuring, recalculating. The room had shifted from indulgent curiosity to something sharper. Attention now carried consequence. He turned back to the audience, not to confront them, but to steady the ground beneath his own feet. I wasn't planning to say much tonight, he continued, his tone even, almost reflective. I know what it feels like to stand in a room where you're not supposed to belong. A faint rustle passed through the front rows. But I've learned something about belonging, he added. It's not about where you stand. It's about what you stand on. He let it breathe. I studied mechanical engineering, he said. Specialized in structural safety systems. I believed, still believe, that progress means nothing if it costs someone their life. The room tightened again. This was no longer anecdotal. This was direction. Rachel felt the narrative tilting away from her. She stepped closer to the podium, not interrupting yet, but reclaiming proximity, as if standing nearer could anchor control. Connor did not look at her. 8 years ago, he said carefully, a safety report was submitted at a Meridian construction site. It warned about brake deterioration, cable corrosion, risk under load stress. His words were technical, precise, measured, not emotional, which made them harder to dismiss. A signature acknowledged receipt of that report. The air seemed to compress. Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a phone screen lit up as someone searched archived articles. Connor's heartbeat pounded once against his ribs, heavy but contained. He did not rush the next sentence. 3 months later, the elevator failed. There it was. No raised voice. No accusation. Just fact. Rachel's pulse spiked. The past she had buried beneath expansion, and press releases rose with unnerving clarity. She remembered the email, the discussion, the pressure from investors, the gamble disguised as calculated risk. She had convinced herself the probability was low. She had been wrong. Connor's voice did not falter. A man died that day. A glass shattered somewhere near the catering station. No one noticed who dropped it. What does this have to do with tonight? Rachel interjected, her voice controlled but thinner now. Connor finally turned toward her fully. Everything, he said quietly. The room held still. That man's name was Kyle Shaw. Recognition flickered like lightning across a few older faces. A woman near the front whispered to her husband. I remember that story. Connor drew in a slow breath. He was 27 years old. He had plans. He had research in progress. He believed that warning people was part of his job. A subtle tremor edged the edges of his composure. Not weakness but human weight. He was my brother. This time no one moved. Rachel's breath stalled in her throat. The distance between them felt smaller than the stage allowed. Connor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The official report concluded operator error, he continued. Case closed. Liability cleared. His gaze moved across the audience. Lawyers, financiers, decision-makers. But the original report said something different. The ballroom temperature seemed to drop. Rachel's mind raced. Who had given him access? How much did he have? How much had survived? Connor reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, not abruptly, not theatrically, and withdrew a folded document. Gasps rippled instinctively, though he moved with calm restraint. This is a copy, he said. The independent assessment written before the accident. The one that identified mechanical failure. The one that was never presented in the final investigation. A murmur ignited, low and spreading. Rachel stepped forward sharply. You cannot present internal documentation out of context. Connor's eyes locked with hers. Context, he repeated softly. The context is that someone knew. The word someone echoed heavier than a name. A venture capitalist near the stage leaned toward his colleague. Is this accurate? He whispered. Across the ballroom, several guests were already pulling up archived filings. Connor continued. Not accusatory, not vindictive. 3 months is a long time, he said. Long enough to replace cables. Long enough to pause construction. Long enough to choose caution. Rachel felt the room slipping through her fingers like sand. Connor's tone sharpened, not in volume but in clarity. When you build something that rises 40 floors into the sky, you don't just sell luxury. You sell trust. Silence. And when trust is traded for schedule, someone pays. The words did not strike like a hammer. They pressed like gravity. Rachel's composure fractured by a hairline crack. You're exploiting a tragedy, she said, but the confidence had drained from her voice. Connor's expression did not change. No, he answered evenly. I've been living with it. The difference landed harder than any accusation. A man near the back stood abruptly. If this document is authentic, this has legal implications. Nathan Price's voice cut through from the side of the ballroom. It is authentic. He stepped forward, tablet raised. Not aggressively but with finality. I've confirmed metadata timestamps and archived correspondence. The independent report was replaced before submission. The room erupted, not in chaos but in collective recalculation. Phones vibrated. Messages fired across networks. Legal teams were quietly alerted. The IPO, tomorrow's triumph, now balanced on a blade. Rachel felt something she had not felt in years. Exposure. Her mind reached for strategies. Deny, deflect, discredit. But Connor had not attacked her. He had told a story. And stories, when grounded in fact, are nearly impossible to silence. Connor stepped slightly back from the microphone, not retreating, making space. I didn't come here to destroy anything, he said quietly. I came because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It waits. The air felt electric. Rachel's voice cracked despite her effort to steady it. Why now? The question slipped out before she could contain it. Connor met her eyes with something deeper than anger. Because tonight, he replied, you chose to put me under a spotlight. A stillness settled that felt irreversible. You wanted to show everyone where I belong, he continued softly. So I'm showing them what I stand on. The ballroom no longer felt like an event. Felt like a reckoning. Rachel's gaze flickered across the crowd. Investors were no longer smiling. Board members were whispering urgently. A senator's aide slipped out to make a call. The foundation she had built her empire upon, the narrative of invincible competence, was fracturing in real time. Connor did not look triumphant. He looked finished. And in that calm completion, something shifted permanently. For the first time in years, Rachel Whitmore did not control the direction of the room. The silence that followed did not belong to her. It belonged to the truth. The silence that followed Connor's last words did not dissolve, thickened. Rachel felt it pressing against her skin, crawling beneath the polished surface she had perfected over 15 years. She had commanded rooms larger than this. She had negotiated with senators, dismantled competitors, redirected markets with a single call. Control had always been her oxygen. Now the air felt scarce. Connor did not raise the document again. He did not dramatize the moment. Instead, he stepped slightly away from the podium, as though the truth required no spotlight once spoken. That quiet restraint unsettled the audience more than outrage ever could. A board member cleared his throat near the front table. Ms. Whitmore, he said carefully, is there any merit to these claims? It was not an accusation. It was worse. It was doubt. Rachel turned toward him slowly, calculating the angle of every camera, every lens trained on her face. Her instinct urged denial. She could still frame this as manipulation, as grief weaponized. She could call security. She could dismiss it as unverified data. But something in the room had shifted beyond strategy. She searched Connor's expression for hostility and found none. That unsettled her further. There was no rage to counter, no recklessness to discredit. He stood there grounded, almost solemn, as if what he had delivered was not revenge but relief. "You're presenting partial information," Rachel said at last, voice steady but stripped of warmth. "Projects at that scale involve countless variables. Decisions are complex." Connor's gaze did not waver. "Was the brake system flagged?" he asked quietly. Rachel's heartbeat thundered against her ribs. "Was it?" he repeated. The simplicity of the question pinned her more effectively than accusation ever could. Across the ballroom, a senior partner from a private equity firm leaned toward his counsel. "We need verification," he whispered. "Now." Phones were no longer discreetly glowing. Screens lit openly. Emails fired. Compliance teams began tracing archived documentation in real time. Rachel felt the architecture of the evening collapsing around her, not physically but reputationally. Tomorrow's IPO valuation was built on perception of strength, on reliability, on trust. Trust was eroding by the second. Connor stepped closer to the edge of the stage, not aggressive, anchored. "I know what it's like to be told the system works," he said calmly. "I know what it's like to believe that accountability is automatic." He paused, letting the room breathe in the words. "It isn't." The truth was not shouted. It was placed. A woman near the center table lowered her glass entirely. "If this is accurate," she said under her breath, "we've been underwriting negligence." That word traveled faster than the rest. Negligence. It moved from table to table like a current. Rachel felt her spine stiffen in instinctive resistance. "You don't understand the pressure at that stage of development," she said, voice tightening. "Delays threaten thousands of jobs. Investors withdraw. Entire projects collapse." Connor nodded slightly. "And one life is acceptable collateral." The question did not contain fury. Contained clarity. Rachel's mouth opened. No defense emerged. The memory surged without permission. The email thread, the conference call, the phrase minimal probability repeated until it felt safe. She had been young, ambitious, terrified of losing momentum. She had told herself she could manage the risk. She had been wrong. Nathan stepped further into view, voice carrying over the rising murmur. "I've confirmed archived internal correspondence indicating awareness of mechanical compromise prior to the accident." Gasps rose openly now. A former state official who had praised Rachel minutes earlier stepped back from her side as if proximity itself carried liability. Connor did not look at Nathan. He did not need reinforcement. The truth was standing on its own. Rachel's voice faltered for the first time. "Why bring this here?" she demanded, not as CEO, but as someone cornered. "Why tonight?" Connor met her gaze with something that held no triumph. "Because tonight you decided to measure my worth in front of everyone," he said quietly. "I decided to measure something else." The room absorbed that sentence fully. It was not an attack. It was balance. A murmur near the entrance drew attention. Two figures had stepped inside. Dark suits, official posture. They did not rush. They did not announce. They observed. Rachel saw them. Recognition flickered. This was no longer contained within a ballroom. This was legal. A board director approached her carefully. "Rachel," he said under his breath, "is there exposure here we're unaware of?" Exposure. The word struck harder than negligence. Rachel felt the structure she had constructed over years. Credibility, dominance, inevitability, splintering in real time. And she understood something with startling clarity. She was no longer controlling the narrative. She was inside it. Connor stepped back from the microphone entirely now. The silence that followed him was not empty. It was heavy with processing, recalculation, moral inventory. He had not accused her of murder. He had not demanded arrest. He had offered fact. And fact was dismantling her more efficiently than fury ever could. The federal agents advanced slowly toward the front. Their movement was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel's breath shortened. The lead agent spoke evenly. "Ms. Whitmore, we need to discuss documentation related to the Lakeview construction site." We'd prefer to do so privately. Every camera in the room adjusted angle. There would be no private resolution. Rachel straightened instinctively, reclaiming posture if not power. This is highly inappropriate timing, she said, but the authority in her tone had thinned. Connor did not move. He did not smile. He simply watched. And in his expression there was something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Release. Because for years he had carried the weight alone. The knowledge that his brother's name had been sealed under a false conclusion. The awareness that the system could choose profit over protection and move on unscathed. Tonight the weight had shifted. Rachel looked at him once more, really looked. Not at the suit. Not at the mechanic. At the man who had walked into her empire without trembling. You could have destroyed me quietly, she said, voice barely audible over the room's hum. Why stand here? Connor's answer came without hesitation. Because you stood here first. The symmetry landed harder than accusation. The agents waited patiently. Investors had begun stepping away from the stage entirely. Conversations now urgent, pragmatic, defensive. Some calculated financial impact. Others recalculated alliances. No one was laughing. The IPO, tomorrow's triumph, was no longer a celebration. It was a liability. Rachel felt the inevitability settle over her like gravity. This was no longer about image. It was about consequence. She nodded once to the agents. I'll cooperate, she said. The words tasted unfamiliar. As they guided her toward a side exit, not restrained but undeniably escorted, the crowd parted. Not out of reverence, out of distance. Connor remained at the front of the room, alone now beneath the chandeliers that had once illuminated her certainty. He did not feel victorious. He felt steady. The truth had not exploded. It had surfaced. And the room that once belonged to Rachel Whitmore now belonged to accountability. The ballroom did not erupt after Rachel stepped away with the agents. It unraveled. The music that had hummed softly beneath the evening's glamour cut off mid-note. Servers stood frozen beside half-cleared plates. Investors who had flown across states for celebration now clustered in urgent, tight circles, voices lowered but frantic. The mood had shifted from spectacle to survival. Connor remained near the stage, not elevated anymore, just present. The spotlight that had once framed him as entertainment now illuminated the empty space where Rachel had stood. And that absence spoke louder than any speech. Within minutes, phones began vibrating in unison across the room. News alerts triggered. Financial analysts were already dissecting the unfolding situation. Social media posts, some from inside the ballroom, spread at a pace Rachel would have admired on any other night. But this narrative no longer favored her. A senior investment partner approached Connor cautiously, as though stepping near something volatile. Is this going to hold up? The man asked, not unkindly but pragmatically. Connor didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the room, at the faces that had once measured him by title rather than character. It already has, he replied quietly. The man nodded once and stepped back, making a call. Across the city, trading desks began recalculating projected valuations. Meridian's anticipated opening bell no longer symbolized momentum. It signaled uncertainty. Analysts flagged potential legal exposure. Overnight headlines shifted from historic IPO to executive under federal review. In a private conference room down the hall, Rachel sat across from the agents, her silver gown suddenly feeling too visible, too reflective. She had changed the world around her for years with decisiveness and strategy. Now she sat still, hands folded tightly in her lap. We're reopening the Lakeview file, one agent said evenly. Documentation suggests prior knowledge of mechanical deficiencies. Rachel's mind replayed the call from 8 years ago. The risk assessment, the cost of delay, the phrase minimal probability echoing like justification. She had convinced herself she was choosing stability, growth, future jobs. She had not imagined this room. I never intended for anyone to be hurt, she said, her voice stripped of authority. The agent did not respond with accusation or comfort. Intent doesn't erase consequence. The sentence lingered between them. Back in the ballroom, the board of directors convened in a hurried, closed-door session. Their tone was no longer celebratory. It was protective. "She's a liability now," one member said bluntly. "If we don't act fast, the entire company sinks with her. Reputation damage is already trending," another added, scanning updates on a tablet. The chairman inhaled sharply. "We need her resignation before markets open." The decision felt clinical, ruthless, necessary. Connor stepped outside onto the balcony for air. The city stretched beneath him, lights flickering across glass towers that had once symbolized aspiration. He rested his hands on the railing, steadying himself not from doubt, but from the aftershock of release. For years, he had imagined confrontation differently, louder, angrier. Tonight had been quiet, controlled, final. Footsteps approached behind him. Nathan joined him, holding his phone low. "It's everywhere," Nathan said. "Major outlets already picked it up." Connor nodded. "Are you ready for what that means?" Nathan asked. Connor's gaze remained fixed on the skyline. "I've been ready for 8 years." Inside, board members requested Rachel's presence once more. She entered the room knowing what awaited her. The silver gown no longer shimmered with dominance. It reflected exposure. The chairman did not waste time. "For the protection of Meridian properties, we are requesting your immediate resignation." The words were formal. The impact was devastating. Rachel's breath caught. She had fought competitors, crushed dissent, outmaneuvered critics. She had never imagined losing her own board in a single night. "You built this with me," she said quietly. "And we intend to preserve it," the chairman replied. There was no anger in his voice, only distance. Rachel understood then what power had always been, conditional. She signed the document without theatrics. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When she stepped back into the ballroom, the room that once revolved around her barely shifted. Conversations paused briefly, then resumed without invitation. No applause, no defense, just consequence. Connor saw her from across the space. Their eyes met for the final time that evening. There was no victory in his expression, only closure. Rachel approached him slowly, the distance between them charged but quiet. "I was 26, she said, voice low enough to avoid microphones. "I thought I could calculate risk." Connor studied her face, searching for deflection. He found none. "You calculated wrong," he answered gently. A tear threatened the edge of her composure, but she held it back. "I can't undo it." "No," he said. "But you can stop hiding from it." The simplicity of his response struck deeper than condemnation. For the first time in years, Rachel felt smaller than her ambition. Smaller than her empire. Smaller than the memory she had suppressed. Outside, press gathered at the entrance. When Rachel exited Meridian Tower not as CEO but as a subject of investigation, camera flashes erupted again, this time without admiration. The same lights that once glorified her success now documented her fall. Headlines spread before midnight. Meridian CEO resigns amid safety cover-up allegations. IPO suspended following federal inquiry. Markets reacted swiftly the following morning. Shares were withheld. Investors withdrew commitments. Partnerships paused indefinitely. Lawsuits resurfaced. The foundation of her empire, once immovable, began to crack under scrutiny. Rachel sat alone in her penthouse apartment as dawn bled into the skyline. News anchors dissected her decisions with surgical precision. Analysts debated ethics versus ambition. For the first time she did not change the channel. She listened. Every word felt earned. Across town, Connor stood in his modest kitchen, morning light spilling through thin curtains. The city sounded different today. Not louder, not quieter, but clearer. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from co-workers. from people he barely knew, from families of construction workers thanking him for speaking. He didn't respond immediately. He poured coffee and stood in silence. Justice had not brought his brother back, but it had restored something that mattered. Truth had moved, and when truth moves, power trembles. Mourning did not soften what had happened, clarified it. By the time the opening bell rang on Wall Street, Meridian Properties was no longer a symbol of unstoppable ascent. Trading was formally delayed pending investigation. Financial networks replayed clips of Connor's speech on a loop, dissecting every word. Analysts debated not just fiscal exposure but moral failure. Commentators who had once praised Rachel's ruthless brilliance now questioned how many corners had been cut in pursuit of dominance. The fall was not dramatic in a cinematic way. It was methodical. Regulators reopened archived files. Former employees stepped forward anonymously, describing ignored warnings on other projects. A pattern began to emerge, one not explosive but corrosive. The image Rachel had spent years polishing began to peel back layer by layer. Civil attorneys representing Kyle Shaw's estate filed a petition to amend the original investigative findings. The suppressed technical report was admitted into the reopened case. For the first time in 8 years, the official narrative shifted. The cause of the accident was no longer listed as operator error. It was classified as preventable mechanical failure, 2 words that restored a name. In a modest courthouse weeks later, a judge formally cleared Kyle Shaw of fault. The record was corrected. The transcript read plainly, without drama. No evidence of negligence by the deceased. Prior safety warnings documented and unaddressed. Margaret Shaw sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap. She did not weep loudly. She did not tremble. She exhaled. Connor stood beside her, not as a mechanic, not as a spectacle, but as a son and a brother who had carried weight long enough. When the judge's ruling concluded, Margaret reached for Connor's hand and squeezed once. "That's my boy," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Microphones extended toward Connor, expecting anger or triumph. He offered neither. "My brother did his job," he said calmly. He warned people. The system failed him. Today that failure was acknowledged. That's what matters. But justice did not stop at recognition. Federal prosecutors filed charges against multiple executives involved in suppressing the report. Hank Morrison, who had long insulated himself with political connections, faced counts of obstruction and falsification of documentation. The legal process unfolded publicly. Court dates were set. Subpoenas were issued. Rachel Whitmore entered that courtroom months later not as a celebrated CEO, but as a defendant. The silver gowns were gone. So was the certainty. Under oath, she answered questions with none of the polish she once carried. Emails were read aloud. Timeline discrepancies exposed. The phrase minimal probability echoed again, this time not as justification, but as evidence of reckless disregard. When the verdict arrived, it did not thunder. It landed. Rachel was found guilty of negligent endangerment and obstruction of an official safety review. She was sentenced to federal time and ordered to pay substantial restitution to affected families. Her personal assets were liquidated to fund settlements and mandatory safety reforms across Meridian's existing developments. No applause followed, but relief did. Outside the courthouse, workers from various construction unions gathered, not to celebrate her incarceration, but to witness accountability. One man shook Connor's hand firmly. "You did what most of us don't get the chance to do," he said. "You made them answer." The satisfaction wasn't cruel. It was earned. Meridian Properties did not collapse entirely. The board restructured leadership. Independent oversight committees were installed. A third-party safety compliance system became mandatory across all projects. The company name would forever carry a scar, but scars, unlike lies, tell the truth. Connor declined offers for media tours and corporate roles. Instead, he accepted a position with a newly formed National Workplace Safety Initiative. The program, funded partially through court-mandated restitution, was named the Kyle Shaw Construction Accountability Foundation. Its purpose was simple: protect whistleblowers, audit mechanical compliance, ensure no warning was buried for the sake of profit again. At the foundation's inaugural launch, Connor stood before a small but determined crowd of engineers, laborers, and advocates. No chandeliers, no velvet ropes, just fluorescent lights and intention. "My brother believed that integrity isn't optional," Connor said, voice steady. "It's structural. Remove it, and everything collapses." The audience rose in applause, not because it was expected but because it was felt. Across the city, in a quiet federal facility, Rachel Whitmore read the ruling transcript again and again. For the first time in her adult life, she had nothing to manage. No narrative to spin. No room to command. Only consequence. In the stillness of that confinement, she confronted a truth she had avoided for years. Ambition without accountability is destruction disguised as progress. Her empire had not fallen in one explosive moment. It had eroded under the weight of a single decision. And that decision had finally answered for itself. Months later, Connor stood outside a construction site reviewing safety certifications with a team of inspectors. The air smelled of steel and dust. Workers moved around him without pretense. One young engineer approached him cautiously. "I heard what you did," she said. "I almost didn't file a report last month. I thought it would cost me my job." Connor looked at her directly. "Did you file it?" She nodded. "They fixed it," she added softly. Connor smiled. "Then it was worth it." The satisfaction wasn't revenge. It was prevention. The night Rachel invited him as a joke had become a turning point none of them anticipated. What began as an attempt to display hierarchy ended as a dismantling of it. The elevator mechanic had not raised his voice. He had raised the truth. And the truth proved heavier than marble floors, heavier than stock valuations, heavier than ego held. As sunset painted the skyline gold, Connor paused beside the scaffolding and looked upward. Buildings still rose. Elevators still carried people toward ambition. The world had not stopped. But somewhere within its machinery, something had shifted. This time, when someone pressed the button to rise, they would do so standing on ground that had been tested. And for the first time in 8 years, Connor felt no unfinished business pulling at him. Justice had not been loud. It had been precise. And it had been enough. Weeks after the verdict, Connor stood at a construction site just before dusk, watching a new lift car glide upward along freshly inspected rails. The metal moved with a steady hum, no tremor, no hidden flaw waiting in the dark. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing the past. He felt like he was building something that would outlast it. Kyle's name now lived where it belonged, not in a footnote of blame, but in the title of a safety program that protected workers who once would have stayed silent. Reports were filed without fear. Repairs were made before deadlines could silence them. The industry had not become perfect overnight, but it had become more careful. And sometimes careful is where real change begins. Rachel's absence from the skyline was no longer Connor's concern. What mattered was that a record had been corrected, a family had been heard, and a system had been forced to look at itself. He had walked into that ballroom as someone underestimated. He walked forward now as someone unburdened. As the elevator doors opened smoothly at the top floor, Connor allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The rise felt different when the foundation held. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes integrity still matters. Like the video, and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales to help us keep telling stories where courage changes the outcome. Rachel was found guilty of negligent endangerment and obstruction of an official safety review. She was sentenced to federal time and ordered to pay substantial restitution to affected families. Her personal assets were liquidated to fund settlements and mandatory safety reforms across Meridian's existing developments. No applause followed, but relief did. Outside the courthouse, workers from various construction unions gathered, not to celebrate her incarceration, but to witness accountability. One man shook Connor's hand firmly. "You did what most of us don't get the chance to do," he said. "You made them answer." The satisfaction wasn't cruel. It was earned. Meridian Properties did not collapse entirely. The board restructured leadership. Independent oversight committees were installed. A third-party safety compliance system became mandatory across all projects. The company name would forever carry a scar, but scars, unlike lies, tell the truth. Connor declined offers for media tours and corporate roles. Instead, he accepted a position with a newly formed National Workplace Safety Initiative. The program, funded partially through court-mandated restitution, was named the Kyle Shaw Construction Accountability Foundation. Its purpose was simple: protect whistleblowers, audit mechanical compliance, ensure no warning was buried for the sake of profit again. At the foundation's inaugural launch, Connor stood before a small but determined crowd of engineers, laborers, and advocates. No chandeliers, no velvet ropes, just fluorescent lights and intention. "My brother believed that integrity isn't optional," Connor said, voice steady. "It's structural. Remove it, and everything collapses." The audience rose in applause, not because it was expected but because it was felt. Across the city, in a quiet federal facility, Rachel Whitmore read the ruling transcript again and again. For the first time in her adult life, she had nothing to manage. No narrative to spin. No room to command. Only consequence. In the stillness of that confinement, she confronted a truth she had avoided for years. Ambition without accountability is destruction disguised as progress. Her empire had not fallen in one explosive moment. It had eroded under the weight of a single decision. And that decision had finally answered for itself. Months later, Connor stood outside a construction site reviewing safety certifications with a team of inspectors. The air smelled of steel and dust. Workers moved around him without pretense. One young engineer approached him cautiously. "I heard what you did," she said. "I almost didn't file a report last month. I thought it would cost me my job." Connor looked at her directly. "Did you file it?" She nodded. "They fixed it," she added softly. Connor smiled. "Then it was worth it." The satisfaction wasn't revenge. It was prevention. The night Rachel invited him as a joke had become a turning point none of them anticipated. What began as an attempt to display hierarchy ended as a dismantling of it. The elevator mechanic had not raised his voice. He had raised the truth. And the truth proved heavier than marble floors, heavier than stock valuations, heavier than ego held. As sunset painted the skyline gold, Connor paused beside the scaffolding and looked upward. Buildings still rose. Elevators still carried people toward ambition. The world had not stopped. But somewhere within its machinery, something had shifted. This time, when someone pressed the button to rise, they would do so standing on ground that had been tested. And for the first time in 8 years, Connor felt no unfinished business pulling at him. Justice had not been loud. It had been precise. And it had been enough. Weeks after the verdict, Connor stood at a construction site just before dusk, watching a new lift car glide upward along freshly inspected rails. The metal moved with a steady hum, no tremor, no hidden flaw waiting in the dark. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing the past. He felt like he was building something that would outlast it. Kyle's name now lived where it belonged, not in a footnote of blame, but in the title of a safety program that protected workers who once would have stayed silent. Reports were filed without fear. Repairs were made before deadlines could silence them. The industry had not become perfect overnight, but it had become more careful. And sometimes careful is where real change begins. Rachel's absence from the skyline was no longer Connor's concern. What mattered was that a record had been corrected, a family had been heard, and a system had been forced to look at itself. He had walked into that ballroom as someone underestimated. He walked forward now as someone unburdened. As the elevator doors opened smoothly at the top floor, Connor allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The rise felt different when the foundation held. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes integrity still matters. Like the video, and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales to help us keep telling stories where courage changes the outcome.